Good morning. I'm Tracy Fortier, a preservation planner with the Massachusetts Historical Commission. Today, I will present one option for funding preservation projects, the Massachusetts Preservation Projects, or MPPF. Following my presentation, Rebecca Curran, Town Planner for Marblehead, and Cara McLaughlin, Executive Director for the House of Seven Gables Settlement Association, will present examples of MPPF grant-funded projects. Please type your questions into the Q&A panel. We will answer questions as time allows at the end of our session. MPPF was established in 1984 and is administered through the Massachusetts Historical Commission, or MHC. MHC is the state's historic preservation office, as many of you know, and is dedicated to preserving our cultural heritage through identifying, evaluating, and protecting our historic resources. MPPF is a state-funded preservation grant program for historic properties, landscapes, and sites listed in the State Register of Historic Places. To date, over $60 million have been awarded to properties throughout the Commonwealth. Applicants to the program must be a municipality or a registered nonprofit. The MPPF program does not provide funding for work on privately owned residences, and information on additional preservation funding options, including funds for private properties, can be found through the Resource Center link on the Preservation Massachusetts website. To be eligible, sites must be listed in the State Register of Historic Places. The register is a compilation of properties that have received local, state, or national designation, such as historic landmarks, individual National Register listing, NR districts, and local historic districts. It's important to note that a property which is included in MACRIS, the Massachusetts Cultural Resource Information System, does not necessarily mean that a property is also listed in the state register. So if you're in doubt, feel free to check with MHC. MPPF grants are used for pre-development, development, and acquisition projects, which I will review in more detail. There are many benefits of an MPPF grant. Some are direct and quantifiable, such as funding repairs to a leaking roof. Other benefits are less tangible. The MPPF program has served as critical seed money to revitalize downtowns, residential neighborhoods, and rural landscapes. Many grantees have used their awards to successfully launch capital campaigns, which you'll hear more about during Cara's presentation. MPPF projects require and rely on a team of experienced preservation professionals, all coming together to apply sound preservation practices to your resource. An MPPF award and the resulting work is newsworthy, sometimes translating to increased publicity and membership. Preservation projects create educational opportunities. For example, the preservation of the Beverly Powder House, shown here, allows school groups to access this historic resource for the first time. MPPF projects create construction-related and professional consulting jobs. And an important benefit of the program is the recording of a preservation restriction on all properties that receive funds. This ensures that the property will retain its historic character for a term of years or in perpetuity. Typically, MHC announces the next round of MPPF grants in December, followed by a mid-March application deadline and award announcements in June. The very short one-year grant cycle begins on July 1 and ends the following June 30th. The MPPF program requires a 50% matching share from the grantee. If you are awarded $50,000, you will provide a matching share of $50,000, resulting in a minimum project total of $100,000. And many grantees provide greater than the 50% required match, resulting in a larger scope of work. The minimum grant request for a pre-development project is $5,000, resulting in a project minimum of $10,000. The maximum pre-development request is $30,000. For development and acquisition projects, the minimum is $7,500 and the maximum request is $100,000. Matching shares can be provided by a federal or a local source of funding, not another state source of funding. Or private donations. For example, federal funding through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, is eligible as a matching share. Those communities that have adopted the Community Preservation Act, or CPA, are eligible to use CPA funds as a source for the match as well. Sources that MHC does not accept as a matching share include other state funds, in-kind services, volunteer time, and uncollected pledges. I will review each of the three types of grants, beginning with pre-development grants, which are awarded to conduct studies necessary for the future development or protection of a property. These studies are often the first step to preservation, and many applicants follow a pre-development grant by applying for a development grant. Pre-development grants help to pay for the consultants, such as the architect and engineer conducting the study of your resource. This type of grant does not pay for actual physical repairs. Pre-development studies include at least the history of the property, identification of character-defining features, a thorough conditions assessment, prioritized treatment recommendations, and related cost estimates. Some studies also include feasibility studies for property use and universal accessibility, plans and specifications for recommended work, and a maintenance plan. And all of the recommendations must follow the Secretary for the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. The League of Women for Community Service received a pre-development grant in 2020. The League purchased the 1857 Farwell Mansion located in Boston's South End in 1920. They have used the building as their headquarters, as well as to house African-American college students, including Coretta Scott during the time she met Martin Luther King. The property is also a documented stop on the Underground Railroad. The pre-development grant resulted in an in-depth historical narrative, exterior and interior conditions assessment, identification of character-defining features, structural analysis, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing report, a landscape assessment, a regulatory analysis, treatment recommendations with cost estimates, and conceptual designs for accessibility. The MPPF grant helped to fund the team of consultants that conducted the study, including an architect, preservation planner, structural engineer, masonry specialist, and an HVAC engineer. The League was awarded a subsequent MPPF development grant this past June, and we are working together on the priority work identified in the study, which includes masonry and window repairs. Additional funding for the development phase of work is being provided by the Boston CPA, the National Park Service, and private funders. The City of Springfield has just completed their MPPF-funded pre-development study of City Hall. The conditions assessment was completed by a team that included architects, preservation planners, a structural engineer, and a masonry consultant. The building envelope was surveyed with the use of a lift, and the resulting report includes a particularly detailed survey of the building's 217 windows, the limestone envelope, columns, classical terracotta ornamentation, structure, and roof. With detailed recommendations and cost estimates in hand, the city immediately began planning for building repairs. Development funding constitutes the largest portion of MPPF grant-assisted projects. Development grants helped to fund actual repairs to historic properties such as window restoration, structural stabilization, and brick repointing. Development grants do not help to pay for the architect or engineer who prepares plans and specs and oversees repair projects. This is a key distinction between a pre-development and a development grant. Additional ineligible expenses include routine maintenance, upgrading mechanical systems, non-historic spaces, moving historic buildings, rehabilitation, constructing additions, and interior spaces, windows, and religious symbols on buildings actively used for religious purpose. This 1793 federal-style tea house was designed by Samuel McIntyre and moved to Glen Magna Farm in Danvers in 1901. A development grant was awarded to address years of water infiltration and insect and squirrel damage. Structural members and decorative features were stabilized in place, and sections were replaced only as needed. A new wood shingle roof was installed. The pediments for urns and statues all needed replacement, and the urns were repaired before being returned to the roof. The Reaper and Milkmaid statues, which are reproductions of the McIntyre originals, were carefully removed from the roof for future restoration. Beginning in 1997, MPPF funds have supported roof and masonry repairs at the Church of the Covenant in Boston. During the recent 2018 grant, stones were reset, mortar joints were pointed, and the side entry brownstone columns were replaced. As part of the grants process, MHC planners work with the project architects to ensure that the contractor's work meets the Secretary's standards. For example, we review mock-ups showing the ability to prepare mortar joints without damaging the adjacent brick or brownstone. We also review the color, texture, and application of replacement mortar. In Leominster, grant funds supported restoration and repairs at this municipally owned house constructed in 1848 by abolitionists Francis H. and Jonathan Drake. Here, the city presents to visitors the role the Drake family played in harboring fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad. This project presents a rare restoration project, which included the removal of building fabric that was added after the building's period of significance. The period of significance was determined to be the time frame during which the Drake family occupied the house. Physical and documentary evidence was needed and used to inform the restoration. For example, the Drake family gathering photograph in the upper right-hand corner provides evidence that the Victorian porch was added after the Drakes occupied the house and was therefore removed. The Bridge Street Cemetery, established around 1661, is the oldest known extant cemetery in Northampton. The city funded a comprehensive master plan in 2016, which formed the basis for the work of this 2018 MPPF development grant. Work included the conservation treatment of 160 markers. CPA funding provided the match. On the left, pedestal supports for this table tomb were reset. On the right, work included gentle cleaning and small fracture and void repair. And each marker was photographed before and after repairs were made, and the conservation treatment was described in detail in a binder provided to the city. The Salem Common Fence has received MPPF development funding to support the city's ongoing restoration efforts. 253 sections, each 8 feet long, comprise the half-mile long cast iron fence constructed in 1850. The process includes labeling each section that is removed for repairs. During the first phase of work, molds were created from intact components of the intricate fence. These are used to cast replacement sections, and finally the fence components are sanded and painted before being reinstalled around Salem's Common. And finally, grant funding can be used to purchase a property which is imminently threatened with loss or inappropriate use. Applicants must clearly demonstrate that acquisition is the only way to assure the preservation of the historic resource. One example is the John Howland Jr. House, located in New Bedford, which WALE, a local nonprofit development agency, purchased with MPPF assistance following a fire at the property. Now, Rebecca Curran, planner for the city of Marblehead, will present work at Fort Sewall.
There, can everyone hear me? Good morning, I'm Rebecca Curran, Town Planner for the Town of Marblehead. And today I'm going to explain the process that Marblehead went through and how we used the Mass Historic Commission MPPF program to complete the preservation of Fort Sewall. Very briefly, Fort Sewall is a rare surviving example of an earthwork fort, established in 1644 as a defensive breastwork with 2 mounted cannons. In 1705, a gun deck was first built at the tip of the fort area and mounted with 12 great guns. It was renovated and expanded several times between 1705 and 1864, and the last time the fort was in service was in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. In 1922, the fort was transferred by Senate and congressional votes to the town for public use in perpetuity. It was named in honor of Judge Samuel Sewall, who later became a justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1975. The fort is owned by the town and under the control of the Board of Selectmen. It's maintained by the Recreation and Park Department, and over the years, it's been enjoyed as a waterfront park, and improvements and repairs have been done as needed. A Fort Sewall Oversight Committee is very active, and they have overseen some major upgrades, including burying of overhead wires, installation of period lighting, and a memorial bench program, to name a few of the things they've done. In addition to normal maintenance and upgrades, there were things that needed to be addressed, like the grates on the doors and the windows, which were corroded, masonry issues, and safety issues. Work needed to be done, but we needed to make sure we were doing things correctly. We were going to touch a fort that was established in 1644. We wanted an overall plan. So the town applied for a pre-development MPPF grant from the Mass Historic Commission to assist with this plan. The town had done a conditions and treatment study for Old Burial Hill, so we had experience with the MPPF grant program and how beneficial it was to that effort to correctly repair and maintain the historic cemetery. The town was awarded the MPPF pre-development grant funding to complete a conditions assessment and treatment report. We went through the designer selection process, and we're very fortunate to select and work with architects and engineers, McGinley Kelso and Structures North. One of the real benefits to working with Mass Historic is the oversight and assistance they provide. And with the developed criteria, we were able to generate proposals from highly qualified firms. So the treatment and conditions report included preservation, restoration, and reuse approach, including code and accessibility, requirements and recommended phasing for the work, prioritized cost estimate, masonry analysis and treatment recommendations, and phase 1 construction documents, and also a cyclical maintenance plan. With the completed treatment report, we now knew what to do and which work was critical and which could wait and which work should be combined. We applied for a second MPPF grant, this time a development grant, to do the first priority items identified, the things that were unsafe or needed immediate attention. And Mass Historic Commission was already invested in the fort, and we were partners in the success of its preservation. The work included replacing the window, grills, doors, door frames, and door grating. Here you can see the before and after, the new grates in the doors. And masonry work on the redoubt. This is a picture during the work, and another at a different phase. And then later still when it was being coated. It also included an unsafe condition, which was a code issue, replacing this with this new lookout. We completed the work by June 30th. And I mentioned this because the deadlines for the MPPF program can be daunting. You find out you got the funds in June, And then all the work needs to be completed by June 30th of the following year. And that is an absolute deadline. You must be highly organized, and the MPPF program is organized, and they make sure you stay on track and help you make sure your scope is doable. In the case of Fort Sewall, there was a lot more to do, but we chose to do the critical items to stay within the time frame. So with the first priority items complete, it was time to tackle the second priority work. This phase of work were also critical repairs. We had the cost estimates prepared with the treatment report updated. And we decided to focus the next development MPPF grant application on just the part of the project that involved work on the interior of the redoubt and the magazine work. We could bid the project under Mass General Law 149 and make certain we met the June 30th deadline, and also would get bids from contractors that were qualified to do historic masonry, since that was the majority of our scope. A second MPPF development grant was awarded, and again, the combination of Mass Historic oversight and our consultants' expertise ensured the contractors to do this type of work were bidding, and the lowest bidder was also qualified to do this type of work. This phase of the MPPF work focused on structural masonry repairs to the redoubt interior and raising the stone dust floor in the redoubt for accessibility. This is just a part of our spec. This is a before condition, you can see, and then this is after. We've raised the floor here and done the masonry work. And this is just before and after of some of the masonry work on the magazines and the replacement of the magazine doors and frames. And this is the other magazine before and after. So because the 100-year anniversary of the date that the federal government gave the fort back to the town coming up in 2022, the town thought it would be a good time to do and complete the other work on the land side of the fort, including replacement of stairs, making the pathways accessible, landscaping, and other elements to help interpret the fort's history. The funds needed to do all the work was in excess of $1 million. The rest of the project funding would need an override of the Proposition 2.5 and a town meeting vote. And I mention this because securing the MPPF grants helped us succeed with that effort. We decided on a strategy to make the expenditure more palatable to the taxpayer, stating that in addition to taxpayer funding, a portion would be funded through grants and a portion through fundraising. Fort Sewall is a beloved park, and the override passed. Having the treatment report that was a clear plan of what we intended to do was also very helpful with the committee's successful fundraising campaign. It gave donors confidence that the project was well thought out. There's a few pictures of the Landworks project that's almost complete. And although it was not paid for through the MPPF program funds, because we had a preservation restriction on the property with Mass Historic Commission, they did need to review and approve all of the other work at the fort. And they really added a lot to shaping the project through that process. This is a historic stairway that was redone that's next to the redoubt, and a wing wall added. The fort pathways are now accessible, and this is some of the work we needed to do along the way. Some more pictures of the pathway. The benches were reset, replaced, and these are some of the new stairways. And this is pathway almost done, and in front of the redoubt. This is, again, we had mock-ups of walls that we were adding, and Mass Historic was involved in making sure we did that correctly. Also, the gun placements were found through ground penetrating radar, and research, and a replica cannon has been ordered. It isn't here yet. And 3 granite insets were placed where the original gun placement was wood. We decided to use a stabilized stone dust due to the harsh environment at Fort Sewall. So this is a picture of one of the insets. The real cannon will go there. And it talks about, there's 3 different types of guns that were used at Fort Sewall. An accessible path that leads to the redoubt is shown here, which didn't exist before, and access to the lower part. And trees were added. These are some of the research that was done for the to represent the early and different periods of guns that were used to create the insets. We also repositioned the flagpole to its original location, and we added lights to the redoubt. In addition to all the work, we also fundraised to create a fund for the future maintenance. And again, the cyclical maintenance plan that was done as part of the treatment report was very helpful in our fundraising effort. And we also included a Fort Ranger program where during the summer months, there'll be docents called Fort Rangers, and that will enhance the historical value of a visit to the fort. Then the last thing I wanted to talk about with the MPPF program, and it might scare some communities away, is the preservation restriction. With a pre-development grant, you're required to enter into a 5 to 10 year restriction, depending on how much money you receive. And with a development grant, you're required to have a preservation restriction in perpetuity. This is a recorded document and ensures that any work performed would be submitted and reviewed by Mass Historic Commission as part of the requirement of the grant. We have found this to be very helpful. As stewards of this incredible property, we welcome and rely on the expertise that Mass Historic Commission provides. As Tracy mentioned, if you have any questions, we're going to put them in the, please put them in the question and answer spot, not the chat function, and we will endeavor to answer them after we've all concluded our talks. And now I will turn it over to Karen McLaughlin to talk about the House of Seven Gables Settlement House. Oh, Kara, you're muted.
Always do that. So hi, everyone. I'm Karen McLaughlin, Executive Director of the House of the Seven Gables Settlement Association, or the Gables for short. The Gables was established as a 501c3 nonprofit in 1908. We own and operate a 2-acre museum campus here in Salem that in 2007 was designated a National Historic Landmark District. Our campus is comprised of several buildings. The most recognized of these is, of course, the Turner Ingersoll Mansion. This house was built in 1668 for John Turner, who was a wealthy sea merchant. It became famous after American author Nathaniel Hawthorne visited the house and was inspired to write his 1851 novel, The House of the Seven Gables. The house was purchased in 1908 by Caroline Emerton, a Salem philanthropist, who restored the house and opened it as a museum. Miss Emerton's goal was twofold. She wanted to preserve the house, but she also wanted to use proceeds from admissions to fund what was then called settlement work to help the poor, mostly immigrant people living in the surrounding area. Today, the Gables continues to fulfill Miss Emerton's goals with a modern approach that includes adult ESL and citizenship classes. In a normal year, we see about 110,000 visitors who explore the house on a guided tour with professional interpreters who share the stories of the people that lived and worked in the home. To better meet the needs for the interpretive space and public access, the Gables embarked on a project to restore 2 rooms on the 2nd floor of the mansion to an earlier configuration. These 2 rooms were the dining room chamber, located here, and the accounting room, which was exactly on the opposite side of the building. These spaces had never been viewed by the public before, and we referred to them and the project as the secret rooms. For those of you that have visited the Gables, you'll recognize the play off of our secret staircase. Today, I'm going to focus specifically on the MPPF funded portion of the project, the structural reinforcement of the dining room chamber. I'll share a bit about the history of the space, the process that we went through to get the funding and execute the work, as well as some additional benefits resulting from the project and the funding. While I'll be using the term we, it's important to note that we had a pretty big team comprised of both internal staff as well as external consultants and preservation professionals who are listed here, and I'll also mention them as we go on. As for space history, sometime in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the dining room chamber in the original portion of the 1668 portion of the mansion was divided into 2 rooms, 2 closets, and a hallway. It was used over different points in time for living quarters, office space, and light collection storage. Since the house opened as a museum in 1910, visiting guests had never viewed the dining room chamber, but the Gables had long considered this possibility to open the room. And while the opportunity was clear to us, a major obstacle to such a restoration was addressing previously identified structural deficiencies in the dining room chamber framing that made the access to the room unsafe for the public. The restoration of the 2nd floor chamber began in 2013. The initial step was to gain access to the summer beam, or the main weight-bearing beam, and the subfloor, so that we could assess and develop a plan to address the structural concerns. Our internal preservation staff carefully removed the partitions that divided the space. And once those were removed, the dining room chamber was open to an earlier configuration. We next removed the upper layer of floorboards, and underneath those, we found what we believe to be the original flooring from 1668. After removing the partitions and the floorboards, we engaged John Watney of Structures North to evaluate the existing structural conditions and develop a creative solution that would enable us to accommodate the visiting public while retaining as much of the original building fabric as possible. So John created plans and specifications to reinforce and stabilize the dining room, the framing for the room. His solution called for installing a T-shaped piece of steel, the length of the summer beam, and sistering the joists with steel channels. We also engaged preservation architect David Hart and architectural historian Bill Finch. And with John's plans, David and Bill on board, we were able to apply for an MPPF development grant to fund the structural reinforcement of the dining room chamber. In addition to a project narrative and these detailed plans and the preservation expertise, we also had to demonstrate things such as the historical significance of the site, of the Gables, and evidence of financial need, as well as community support for the project. After receiving a grant award from the Mass Historic Commission, we followed program requirements and solicited competitive bids to perform the structural and associated work, and we selected American Steeple and Chimney as our general contractor. We started in the dining room. To facilitate the installation of the sister joists, without compromising the original dining room lab and plaster ceiling, we removed the first floor 1976 wire lab and plaster ceiling. We also removed the crown moldings and the beam casings. We then inspected the joists and measured for the steel. On the 2nd floor, we removed the boarding over the summer beam. We also carefully cut away the floorboards where necessary to provide room for the steel adjoining plates. We then cut an 8-inch deep mortise the entire length of the summer beam to receive the T-shaped steel reinforcement. We worked with Cassidy Brothers to fabricate the steel. Here you can see it arriving, going through a window on the accounting room side and then coming into the dining room chamber. And here is some video footage of the steel beam. Workers from American Steeple and Cassidy Brothers installing the beam. So clearly this created some jobs, and we had a great team working with us. The summer beam also required intervention at the east end because a portion of the chimney girt had been cut away at an earlier time. We had to replace it with a substantial piece to provide a solid material to receive the summer beam steel reinforcement. The end of the summer beam was also compromised, so we had to scarf a piece of oak to achieve proper connection with the repaired chimney girt. In the end, all of these interventions enabled us to structurally reinforce the framing of the dining room chamber while preserving as much of the original building fabric as possible. And then after this steel installation, we proceeded to restore both rooms, the dining room chamber by reinstalling the floorboards, and then in the dining room, reinstalling a ceiling, the beam casings, and the crown molding. To accommodate future investigations as well as architectural tours, we installed viewports in the dining room chamber floor, as well as in the dining room chamber ceiling, so that original plasters, like the original materials, like the floorboard, the lath and plaster, can be seen alongside the modern interventions. So the benefits of receiving an MPPF grant were significant and extensive for the Gables. Most notably, the grant provided us with half of the funding that we needed to complete the structural reinforcement, which was the most critical and expensive part of the larger project. But there were other benefits as well. The requirement to have professional expertise was important, since we had some but limited expertise on staff. We also had the oversight of the Mass Historic Commission team led by Tracy Fortier. As Tracy mentioned, the MPPF development grant only covers construction-related costs. We were fortunate in the earlier stages of the project to also have received funding from the National Trust and Essex National Heritage, which helped us pay for the professional expertise. In my opinion, if your project is actually worthy of MPPF funding, it's likely that it's also worthy of grants from other funders like these. But beyond the grant funding, the MHC seal of approval also enabled us to gain momentum with individual donors and community engagement. With close to half of the funds needed for the entire project raised through MPPF and the other grants, we were able to launch a mini capital campaign to raise the remaining funds necessary to complete the other phases of our project. The project also gained a lot of attention, and we received some great newspaper coverage from local and regional newspapers. WCBB also gave us some TV coverage. And all of this helped create more awareness around the historical significance of our site and helped us engage a broader audience. We made a lot of discoveries throughout the project. Most interesting of these, I think, was some of the wallpaper and ceiling treatments. When we removed the board partitions in the dining room chamber, we found the presence of a relatively rare ceiling treatment dating back somewhere between 1860 and the mid-1870s. It had a geometric design printed on a polished or satin ground that reflects the light and was bordered with a red strip of paper. We also found evidence of wallpaper in the accounting room, which turns out to be one of the earliest wallpapers found in the mansion. With the discoveries that we made and the additional funds raised through the capital campaign, we were able to restore the accounting room with wallpaper reproduced by Delphi paper hangings and paint that was selected based on federal era mantle and paint and moldings that were in the room. Aiding us in the wallpaper analysis and paint analysis were Richard Nylander and Christine Thompson. Christine's now a Gables board member, which is just great. So, with the structural reinforcement of the dining room chamber complete and the second floor spaces restored to an earlier configuration, we were now ready to allow visitors to circulate through the entire second floor area in the original 1668 structure. This greatly improved the logistical flow of our tour, which previously was a bit of a back and forth between these rooms. So while we could now physically maneuver visitors through the two spaces, we needed to determine what stories we wanted to share in the dining room chamber. We used that as an opportunity to develop a new interpretive plan for the entire site that focuses on the themes of fortune, fame, and philanthropy. The dining room chamber is now open and now falls about halfway through the tour of the house. And we use the space to focus our visitors on the idea that the House of the Seven Gables was built using wealth acquired through Salem's maritime trade, became famous after Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote his novel, and was saved by Caroline Emerton and her service to Salem. We're very grateful to the Mass Historic Commission for funding this important project. Their initial vote of confidence and investment enabled us to complete the critical work needed to further proceed with our goals to interpret and open the dining room chamber to the public and improve the logistical flow of the tour, all while ensuring that we adhered to the highest preservation standards. You can find out more information about our organization, the MPPF grant program, our Marblehead's Fort Sewall project through the information below. You can also feel free to reach out directly to Tracy, Becky, or me. We all thank you for your time and attention, and we'll now entertain any questions.
Thank you, Kara and Rebecca, for sharing your useful case studies of applying pre-development and development MPPF funds. We've been typing answers in the Q&A box. I trust that everyone can see all of the Q&As. If you have additional, please go ahead and type them in. We do have just a couple of minutes left in our session. If we don't see additional questions, I will repeat one of them, which was asked, included source of matching shares for the program, and whether or not donations were considered an eligible match. And yes, they are, but we need to know that you have those funds in hand. So a promise of a donation, for example, dispersed over the course of a year or down the line, is not eligible. We do need proof that you have those funds. The MPPF program is a matching and a reimbursement program. So, and as I mentioned, it's a quick one-year program. So if we need to know, and we ask that you illustrate in your application that you are prepared and that you're able to land running. If you're awarded in June, we really do start quickly in July. And part of your ability to match the program is critical. So, or providing evidence of your ability to match the grant funding is critical. Another question we often receive is it possible to apply for pre-development and development at the same time? And no, you can't. It has to be one or the other. But as we've mentioned, you can apply for subsequent grants, and you do need to complete the first grant completely before you are eligible for a subsequent grant. And typically that means you need at least a year in between. If you are working on a pre-development grant, you're awarded in July, your consultant team at best will be in place October or November. And as I mentioned, our application deadline is typically March. So it's extremely rare that that pre-development study will be completed by the time the application deadline, and you would need those materials to include in your application. I do see another question came in. Oh, it's a thank you. You're welcome. One other question we receive is, do you have to own the property for which you are applying? And the answer is no. You can be leasing your property, but you need to illustrate that you have at least, that you have a long-term lease on the property, at least 25 years. And I didn't know if Kara or Rebecca had anything to add. And I'm going to continue to check questions.
Somebody asked you to repeat the requirements for the matching funds.
So the matching requirement is the amount of the funds that you are awarded. So if you are awarded 10,000, you have to match with an additional 10,000. You will pay for your work as you're progressing first, and provide us evidence that you have paid your consultant or contractor, and then MHC reimburses you. So we actually ask that you illustrate that you have a little bit more than the 10,000 match in hand, or an additional 25%, and that is for cash flow purposes. If you have more specific questions about the match, you can email me or another one of the MPPF grant managers or planners. And if you were asking about the source of match, it's important to keep in mind that another state agency cannot provide the match. So federal funds are eligible, local funds are eligible, and we consider CPA funds a match, and that's a frequently used matching source. Donations, private donations are eligible. Your own bank account, a loan, you just need to provide that in your application. So we are asked to wrap up. And again, I thank you for watching our presentation, and please send us questions if you have them.
Thank you.
Thank you.